Welcome back, everyone. Well, as promised, we're going to dive back into some history today, and I thought it would be most appropriate to dive back into history using some stories of the history of Russia and Ukraine. So that's what we're going to do. This is specifically Epic History TV's history of Russia, but it has a lot of elements of the history of Ukraine as well. And it seems very timely to talk about this. Also trying something new today. I'm making this video in 4K. It's the first time doing one of these videos from home in 4K. I've done on-site videos that way. So we'll see how it goes. We're going to try some different things with format and thumbnails and things like that, just to see if we can't grow the channel a little more and get more people excited about history. So join me in this journey as we talk about the history of Russia using Epic History TV. We've got a link in the description to their original content if you want to be able to see that without my commentary. Here we go.
For thousands of years, the lands known today as Russia and Ukraine were inhabited by nomadic tribes and mysterious Bronze Age cultures. The only record they left were their graves. In the great open grasslands of the south, the steppe, they buried their chieftains.
So one of the things that makes it really challenging understanding some of the very ancient history of some of these cultures and some of these nations, and we should point out that the idea of a nation doesn't really exist for most of human history, not the way we know it today. Cultures, yes, people groups, tribes, things like that, but not really nations. We have empires that arise at certain times. You have kingdoms like the Egyptians. You have the Assyrians and the Babylonians and the Romans and the Greeks. But nations as we know it, not really a concept. We get spoiled with histories of places like ancient Egypt, who left hieroglyphs and left these incredible records of their history, even though we only discovered them recently in terms of being able to interpret them, and Rome, things like that. Most of the places in the world that have these incredibly rich, deep histories, we don't know a lot of it because they just didn't write stuff down for us. It was more oral histories.
Beneath huge mounds called kurgans. The ancient Greek historian Herodotus called these people Scythians.
And we should mention with Herodotus, yes, he's known as the father of history. Yes, he wrote a lot of things down about a lot of places other than Greece. Yes, he also regularly embellished some of that information. So as with all things history, we have to compare it against what we discover in archaeology, compare it against what we know from other people who may have written things down. But when he's our only source, you got to take everything with a grain of salt a little bit.
Their lands were overrun by the same nomadic warriors who brought down the Roman Empire.
So they're kind of a highway for other people who come through, the Huns and the Avars, the Goths coming down. They're just kind of in the way. And for most of that time, they're pretty quiet and not making much noise on the world stage, but that's going to change.
Was then settled by Slavs. They shared some language and culture, but were divided into many different tribes.
And it's interesting to point out here, if you're of my generation and you remember the nation of Yugoslavia, which existed here, Yugoslavia just basically, I think, means the South Slavs. Yugo meaning a word for Slav, for South. So Yugoslavia was the collection of peoples that made up the South Slavs. And this is where you start to see the roots of what will eventually cause World War I, because you have Russia being an East Slavic people, and you have the South Slavs being their kind of ancient brethren, even though, history has divided them in many ways.
They shared some language and culture, but were divided into many different tribes. Vikings from Scandinavia, known in the east as Varangians, rode up Russia's long rivers on daring raids and trading expeditions.
Isn't it interesting how much the Vikings. And Viking is just really more of a descriptive word than the name of their group or their people. It really just means Nordic warriors who attacked and raided other places. But, I mean, you got the Vikings showing up in North America. You've got them showing up in France in large numbers. Normandy was largely a Viking and French meshed culture. You've got them showing up in Britain a lot. You've got them showing up here in the Slavic empires.
According to legend, the East Slavs asked a Varangian chief named Rurik to be their prince and unite the tribes. He accepted and made his capital at Novgorod. His dynasty, the Rurikids, would rule Russia for 700 years.
Pretty interesting how this happens, and the same kind of thing happens with the Celts in France, for example, and later the Frankians. When you face threats from outside of your group, suddenly all the tribes and all the different factions who maybe were warring against each other start teaming up. Same thing happened in the West in the 19th century in what became the United States, where you have different Native American tribes who had been at war with each other eventually kind of joined together to face the oncoming threat of the white man from the East. And so there's nothing that unites a people much like an outside threat coming at you to force everybody to band together. And this is amazing. This is 700 years that this Rurikid dynasty is on the throne of what we know today as Russia. It was kind of Novgorod at the time, but that's longer than any dynasty has been on the throne in a place like Britain, for example.
His people called themselves the Rus and gave their name to the land.
Russians.
Rurik's successor, Oleg, captured Kiev, making it the capital of a new state, Kievan Rus.
And I learned something. I mentioned this in my video a couple of days ago, how we've called it Kiev, the capital city of Ukraine today, for as long as I can remember. And then suddenly it seemed like in the news they started saying Kyiv, and they spelled it Kyiv. Well, Kiev, I guess, is the Russian word for the city. Kyiv, Kyiv, is the Ukrainian. So that's why everybody's using the Ukrainian, which is much more, the local word. And a lot of cities, we've talked about this in the past, how a lot of cities, a lot of states have very different names. Germany, we call one of their major cities Munich, but in German it's München. And so there's almost always going to be different names for a city or a country or a place, depending on where you live and what language you speak.
A century later, seeking closer ties with the Byzantine Empire to the south, Vladimir the Great adopted their religion and converted to Orthodox Christianity. He is still venerated today as the man who brought Christianity to Ukraine and Russia.
A lot of times, adopting Christianity or adopting any religion was much more about political expediency and getting along with other people necessarily than it might have been about a deep desire to convert. I'm not saying he didn't have that, but King John of England at one point actually considered converting to Islam in order to keep his throne by uniting himself in alliance with Muslim rulers. And so it's not an uncommon thing to see that happen.
Yaroslav the Wise codified laws and conquered new lands. His reign marked the golden age of Kievan Rus. It was amongst the most sophisticated and powerful states in Europe. But after Yaroslav's death, his sons fought amongst themselves. Kievan Rus disintegrated into a patchwork of feuding princedoms, just as a deadly new threat emerged from the east. The Mongols under Genghis Khan had overrun much of Asia.
And we can't really appreciate just how huge this area is. It looks like, okay, they're not really that far away, but this is an enormous amount of ground to cover. And you would not think, looking at this map and looking at the territory and how harsh some of this territory is, that a Mongol empire all the way over here would be a threat to anybody over here.
Now they launched a great raid across the Caucasus Mountains and defeated the Kievan princes at the Battle of the Kalka River, but then withdrew. 14 years later, the Mongols returned. A gigantic army led by Batu Khan overran the land. Cities that resisted were burnt, their people slaughtered. The city of Novgorod was spared because it submitted to the Mongols.
I want to take a little bit of a deeper look at some of the numbers and some of the history behind this fight. All right, so the Mongol invasion of Kiev and Rus is 1236 to 1242. And the Rus principalities become vassals of the Mongol Golden Horde during this time. And you can see here that in 1236, Mongol Turkic cavalry has something like 35,000, plus another 40,000 Turkic auxiliaries. And remember, at this time that we've done Turkish history, the Turks are much further east than they are later on. They're not in what we know today as Turkey. The Russians, the Kievan Rus, have 25 to 50,000, so similar numbers. But they lose 500,000 people. Most of them are going to be civilians. That's 6 to 7% of the population of Rus at that time. So even then, they had a massive population. But to lose 500,000 is a huge, huge deal at that time.
Its prince, Alexander Nevsky, then saved the city again, defeating the Teutonic Knights at the Battle of the Ice, fought above a frozen lake. He remains one of Russia's most revered heroes. The Mongols ruled the land as conquerors. Their new empire was called the Golden Horde, ruled by a Khan from his new capital at Sarai. The Rus princes were his vassals. They were forced to pay tribute or suffer devastating reprisal raids.
So why do you have vassals instead of just outright controlling it yourself? Well, it's just a massive amount of ground, and when you've conquered a lot of different groups of people, it's better to have someone on the ground who you believe is going to be loyal to you, who speaks the language, who's one of those people who will control it on your behalf, but still submits to you and can be called to war, can be paying taxes, things like that. It's an ideal situation when you're trying to run large, differing people groups.
They called their oppressors Tatars. They lived under the Tatar yoke. Alexander Nevsky's son, Daniel, founded the Grand Principality of Moscow, which quickly grew in power.
And another example, we call it Moscow. I believe in Russian it's called Moskva. So just, whenever you see those differing names, that's a big reason why.
Under the great Uzbek Khan, the Tatars converted to Islam. A rising power, the Grand Duchy of Lithuania defeated the Tatars at the Battle of Blue Waters and conquered Kiev. 18 years later, Dmitry Donskoy, Grand Prince of Moscow, also defeated the Tatars at the Great Battle of Kulikova Field. After years of infighting, the Golden Horde now began to disintegrate into rival khanates. Constantinople, capital and last outpost of the once great Byzantine Empire, fell to the Turkish Ottoman Empire.
In 1453 is very often marked as the end of the medieval period. With the fall of Constantinople, it's kind of considered to be the beginning of the modern era, and by a lot of people. I mean, modern is a relative term, but think about this. This is really kind of the end of 2,000 years of a Roman Empire or Roman state of some kind. I mean, there are client states that claim to be, like the Holy Roman Empire, things like that, but they're really not. This is really the end of an era in many ways, and you can see how they were shrinking, and now you have the Golden Horde breaking up. Lithuania, the Poland-Lithuanian Commonwealth is going to rise to power, and it's amazing in all of this that you have a Russian state that is able to rise out of all this, because it just seems like there's no way that could happen.
Some hailed Moscow as the Third Rome, the seat of Orthodox Christian faith. Now Rome and Constantinople had fallen. Meanwhile, the Grand Princes of Moscow continued to expand their power, annexing Novgorod and forging the first Russian state. At the Ugra River, Ivan III of Moscow faced down the Tatar army and forced it to retreat. Russia had finally cast off the Tatar yoke. Under Grand Prince Vasily III, Moscow continued to grow in size and power. His son, Ivan IV, was crowned the first Tsar of Russia. He would be...
And that name Tsar, Kaiser in German, and it all comes from Caesar, which Caesar is our way of pronouncing it. I think Kaiser is probably more how Julius Caesar would have pronounced his name. But Tsar is from that same root word. Ivan the Terrible, as we remember him, he's remembered very differently, I think, in Russia. I don't think he's viewed as this tyrant who was bloodthirsty and things like that, the way that he's been spun to a lot of us in the West.
Remembered as Ivan the Terrible. Ivan conquered Tatar lands in Kazan and Astrakhan, but was defeated in the Livonian War by Sweden and the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Ivan's modernizing reforms gave way to a reign of terror and mass executions, fueled by his violent paranoia.
And there's a brief mention of Sweden there. Sweden is a world power at this point. I mean, they're one of the most powerful countries in Europe and therefore in the world. And because of the rise of Poland, because of the rise of the Prussians at this time, because of the Russians, all of that is going to combine to reduce the influence of Sweden. And we've done a series on that, if you want to check that out.
Russia was still vulnerable. Raiders from the Crimean Khanate were able to burn Moscow itself. But the next year, Russian forces routed the Tatars at Molody, just south of the city. Cossacks now lived on the open steppe, a lawless region between three warring states. They were skilled horsemen who lived freely and were often recruited by Russia and Poland to fight as mercenaries.
So isn't it interesting, even back in the 1500s, how we see that this area becomes volatile and it becomes a place where people are warring over it. We see a Crimean War in the 1850s. We see Crimea becoming the source of conflict again here in the last 10 years. And we're seeing the conflict today. I mean, these are ancient's a strong word. These are rivalries and fights that go back hundreds and hundreds, if not sometimes thousands of years.
Ivan the Terrible's own son, the Tsarevich, fell victim to one of his father's violent rages, bludgeoned to death with the royal scepter. The Cossack adventurer Yermak Timofeyevich led the Russian conquest of Siberia, defeating Tatars and subjugating indigenous tribes. In the north, Arkhangelsk was founded, for the time being Russia's only seaport linking it to Western Europe.
And that becomes, I mean, to this day, one of their most important ports. I mean, if you're an American, think Norfolk, for example, or Pearl Harbor. I mean, these are important places where, the Russian fleet, this is going to be their main port of being able to go out into the rest of the world in the West.
Though it was icebound in winter. Ivan the Terrible was succeeded by his son, Fyodor I, who died childless. It was the end of the Rurikid dynasty. Ivan's advisor, Boris Godunov, became Tsar. But after his sudden death, his widow and teenage son were brutally murdered, and the throne seized by an impostor claiming to be Ivan the Terrible's son.
Time for the Romanovs.
He too was soon murdered. Russia slid into anarchy, the so-called Time of Troubles. Rebels and foreign armies laid waste to the land, and the population was decimated by famine and plague.
And let's take a look at those numbers as well. So during the Time of Troubles, which ended in 1613, which is the beginning of the Romanov dynasty, it's estimated that 1 to 1.2 million people died during that time. Some areas of Russia experienced population declines of over 50%. Just unbelievable. You know, even though that was pretty violent, that time of troubles, this was a dynasty that had been on the throne for what? Almost a millennium. I mean, 800 years. And then the Romanovs are going to be on the throne for another 300 years after that. And so most of Russia's history is two dynasties that go over 1,000 years combined. That's incredible stability. But boy, it's all going to go downhill here for a few years. And then, of course, after 1917, again, a period of great instability.
Polish troops occupied Moscow. Swedish troops seized Novgorod. The Russian state seemed on the verge of extinction.
So I think that's actually a really good place for us to stop. I know we didn't get real far into the history, but I think that stopping right at the beginning of the Romanov dynasty is going to be a good jumping off point for us to continue with this moving forward. So please let me know your thoughts. If you like this and you want to see more of this history, please hit that like button. And let me know in the comment section below something you learned today that you did not know. And if you have something to add to the period we just talked about, some more information, add that as well. Let's learn together. Let's grow in our understanding, because understanding the past is going to give us a much better view into what's going on in our world right now. And if you didn't see what I had to say about the conflict between Russia and Ukraine, I did a couple of videos on that, and I'll put the links here to both of those so you can check them out. Thanks a lot. We'll see you again tomorrow.